Another year, another really stupid Disney live action remake that I don't think anyone was surprised by this time. I think the movie really just speaks volumes to what our culture is like and how fed up normies are with the identity politics and culture wars. We just want escapism, that's all. We just want to go to the movies and see a good story once in a while. Something that not many people know about me is that I actually really love Disney princess movies. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Let it go, you feel me? So I take this movie very seriously considering that it's like the third or fourth fucking remake of this movie. What I'll say is that because I love these Disney princess movies so much, this one was probably the most frustrating review I've had to do. And I know I've only done like 8 or 9. Hard Eyes was not as bad because I wasn't as emotionally invested. And same goes with The Monkey. Plus, those writers were just completely incompetent. This movie just really hit me personally, though. So let's get right into the preliminary hearing. The movie stars Rachel Zegler, who was decent in the newest Hunger Games movie. Even though it was an untraditional storyline, it was fine. She was also in Shazam 2, which I was just completely underwhelmed by. Speaking of DC movies, Snow White also stars Gal Gadot, who is very untalented and is apparently controversial these days. She used to be like the face of female empowerment with Wonder Woman, but then I guess the left remembered that they have to hate Jewish people. Obviously, Gal Gadot is a Jewish woman who served in the IDF. We all remember the marketing campaign for this movie. It raised immediate red flags. Rachel Zegler is just a walking virus in Hollywood. I'll be very surprised if she gets any more high-profile roles. She made some comments about how this new take on Snow White is going to discard original ideas for a more modern take, like women can take care of themselves and they don't need a man to save them all the time, which if you've seen the original Snow White, you'd know that that's one of the biggest themes of her character is that she's very delicate. Not to mention that there's absolutely no way to tell what Rachel Zegler's political views could possibly be or who she possibly voted for in the 2024 elections. But in all seriousness, her reckless actions have caused Disney to do rewrites, reshoots, and what I'll say is it's too little too late. Like I said, this movie is frustrating, it's offensive and insulting to people like me, just basically shitting on the chests of people who love Disney princess movies. The movie is rated PG and runs at 109 minutes, but dude, it feels so much longer than that. It's so dragged out. I was confident leaving the theater that it was at least 2 hours and 15 minutes. It has a budget of around 210 million, and so far it's not looking great for Disney. From what I'm looking at right now on Saturday the 22nd, it's only made about $16 million, so this is going to be a flop. They could have spent all that time on a brand new Disney princess. I miss that 7-year period where we had 4 brand new Disney princesses. We haven't had a brand new Disney princess in 9 years, and we haven't had a really good Disney princess movie in 12 years. But I try not to complain too much because there was a 30-year gap in between Disney princesses at one point. And I know a lot of people think that Raya is a Disney princess. She's not. I know Disney said she is, but where's the music? It's not a musical. Oh, well, that's awfully petty, Judge. It's really not that big a deal. Yes, it is. She is not a Disney princess. I don't care that Disney said she is, which is a shame because that was actually a pretty entertaining movie. And then a quick synopsis from IMDb. A princess joins forces with 7 dwarves to liberate her kingdom from her cruel stepmother, the evil queen. Obviously a live-action adaptation of the 1937 film. There's really nothing interesting to say about the trailer other than there's a part where it says the classic story comes to life, which is just a total fucking lie. This movie completely changes the original story and completely misses the point of Snow White as a character. I honestly think this movie would have done better if they did it like they did the Lion King remake, where they just do a frame-for-frame recreation with nothing to add to the original. This new movie, I can't emphasize enough how much it butchers Snow White as a character. From this point on, I'll be talking about spoilers, so if you want to hear my final verdict spoiler-free, skip to this time in the video. So I'll talk about the characters first, starting with Snow White since she has easily the most problems with her character. Right off the bat, instead of her being named Snow White because her skin is white as snow, she's named Snow White because she was born while it was snowing, which, I mean, seriously, are you kidding me? That's like the most uncreative, lazy excuse I've ever seen for a race swap. They should have done it like where her mother was having really bad pain during her pregnancy, but when the first snowstorm came, then she started feeling better. I just came up with that a few minutes ago. It's not perfect, but it would have been 1,000 times better than this. Now, when the queen asks the mirror, who is the fairest of them all, she's not talking about treating people fairly, because then the mirror would never say the queen. She's talking about fair skin, as in like a pale skin tone. And this whole idea is just one of the many examples of how the movie undermines Snow White as a character. Rachel Zegler does not look like Snow White. She's, I believe, half Polish, half Latina. I mean, you could say she looks German maybe, but she does not look like Snow White. The gold and blue dress she wears is the only thing that really helps her to look like Snow White. Everything else is messed up. And then on top of that, you have Rachel Zegler as a person. Now, there's this idea in theater that if you're an actor, you do not leave the stage area during the intermission. You do not interact with the audience because it'll totally take them out of the immersion. And if you absolutely have to go and interact with the audience, you have to stay in character or at least be a representation of your character. And as we discussed before, Rachel Zegler is just the opposite of Snow White. She's toxic, she's arrogant, and she's just basically everything that Snow White isn't. And it just gave the movie a really hard time convincing me that she is playing the same character from the 1937 movie. Originally, Snow White was supposed to be the embodiment of purity, grace, and kindness. She's not wise like Tiana is, she's not brave like Mulan is, and she's definitely not rebellious like Jasmine is. The writers make this sorry-ass attempt to add in those extra character traits by making her brave and bold, even though those character traits clash. All of these factors that I've mentioned are why I believe that the movie just undermines the entire point of Snow White as a character and just ruins the whole experience for me. And I'll get into more of it later because, believe it or not, it actually gets worse. The queen in this movie is just way too dramatic. Now, Gal Gadot does fine in the first 20 minutes of the movie, but what she's doing is she's just gassing herself. Wrong choice of words. To rephrase, she's just spending all of her talent in those first 20 minutes, and the rest is just way over the top. Jonathan, who is supposed to be the prince from the original, is now this selfish criminal who's probably also a communist. Now, I personally believe that the only thing a remake could have added to this IP was if they expanded the role of the prince in the story. And if you remember, Rachel Zegler was saying stuff publicly like, she's not going to get saved by the prince in this one. Obviously, Disney had to go back and change it. And that's what I mean by it was too little too late. And then the dwarves are yet another part of this movie that makes it so much more frustrating. Apparently, when you give actual people with dwarfism representation in Hollywood, that's too offensive to people with actual dwarfism. So instead they just use CGI dwarves. But then when they realized how beyond brainless this is, they cast a real dwarf to pacify the audience. The dwarves are so hard to look at. They have a terminal case of the uncanny valley. Dopey is really the only exception. In the original, he's just this goofball, but in this new one, they took the opportunity to add more emotion to his character with the CGI, and it actually works. He's very easy to sympathize with, but it sort of goes a little bit overboard and becomes just like a pity party for him, but he's really the only one that benefits from the CGI. The story is a mess. The writers hate Snow White and just Disney princesses in general. Now, while they did abandon the blatant woke propaganda for something a little bit more subtle and in its place just a blatant critique of capitalism, because I guess that's popular now. And then, if they have a little bit extra time in the runtime and a little bit more room in the script, maybe it would be cool if they threw in a little Snow White narrative. The movie starts with a little bit of backstory that we didn't get in the original about Snow White's parents and then how the evil queen came to power. Her mother died of an illness, and then her father remarried to the evil queen, and then her father went on some mission and then never came back. And I mean, it was all right. They had a cute little song to go with it, and it was just a good addition to the original story, but they just kind of ruin it because they try to fit this filler backstory into the story at hand by making you think that her father might actually still be alive, but then it's revealed that the queen actually had him killed. And it just seems kind of pointless. We already get that she's evil, and the investment just did not match the return. For a while, the story actually remains pretty faithful, though it feels incredibly rushed, with the exception, obviously, that the prince isn't the prince anymore. He's just this criminal rebel. And it's the beginning of their relationship, just ruining the vision of their original characters. They're not immediately in love like they were before. I was hoping it would be an opportunity for the writers to, put in some romantic tension and build up, but they try and fail. One day, the queen asks her magic mirror who the fairest of all is. It says Snow White, so she has her huntsman bring Snow White out into the forest to murder her. Now, they race swap the huntsman, which is interesting because he's like the right hand of this evil queen who is suspiciously similar to right wing leaders, so it doesn't really line up with Disney's political allegory narrative. He lures her into the forest, tries to kill her, but he can't bring himself to do it, so she runs into the forest. And then for the next few minutes, we actually get some good nostalgia where she's meeting the animals for the first time. They're still very cute, obviously, but again, it's completely wrong because she is not Snow White. Snow White finds the dwarf's cabin, and instead of cleaning it like she does in the original, she just goes upstairs and straight up crashes in their bed. Then we get probably the best part of the movie, but even still, it's kind of bittersweet. We get the Hi-Ho song, which is a pretty hard song to mess up, but they actually add to it, and it was pretty good. It was probably the only part of the movie that I actually liked and thought was worthwhile, but again, it's just those dwarves are so weird to look at. The dwarves come back to their cottage and then find Snow White pass the shit out in their beds. And then for the next few minutes, again, it's pretty similar to the original, but just feels super rushed. Eventually, we get a pretty faithful recreation of the Whistle While You Sing song, but instead of Snow White and the animals cleaning the house, like I said before, it's Snow White teaching the dwarves how to get along, and then they clean the house. Then they decide that Snow White should stay at the cottage to take refuge from the evil queen, which I just think is so stupid because now she's pretty much just freeloading off of them. I feel like the whole point of the original movie where she cleans the cottage herself is just like, now that she did them that favor, in return they will let her take refuge in their cottage. She literally comes to their house, sleeps in their bed, and then when they catch her in their beds, she's just like, oh, you guys need to get along and clean this shit up. And I mean, she does a couple of things to help them out here and there, but it's just another one of those instances when the movie misses the whole point of the original plotline. They completely skip the part where Snow White makes dinner and then the dwarves all wash their hands because God forbid such oppression be shown on screen to an audience. Anyways, the next day, the dwarves are off to work they go, and then the writers remember, oh yeah, Jonathan exists, so they need to pacify the audience, so he needs to be in there for some reason. Now this is where Disney just completely assassinates the original Snow White. She's out in the forest because obviously that's the safest thing to do when the queen is after her, and then she runs into Jonathan and his group of rebels. Snow White and Jonathan start butting heads. She thinks that he's selfish, which is just completely out of fucking character for Snow White. The original Snow White would have seen the best in everyone, but in this version, she's not even kind about it. She just clearly expresses her distaste for him. And then Jonathan thinks that she's just this entitled, spoiled, elitist princess. And then we get an entire song dedicated to mocking the idea of these Disney princesses. The whole point of the song is basically that society is unfair to people with little power, and a princess struggling to deal with that reality is just whiny, and in general, being a female heir to a monarch's throne is just pathetic. I was so offended when they played this song. I was like, because it's pissing in the faces of little children who like these movies and adults of all ages who grew up with these movies. And like I said, it just completely assassinates the characters because it provokes hostility between them, which was something that was originally unthinkable between these two characters. And I understand that they were just trying to break them down and then build them back up, but we're already halfway through the movie and there's still so much more to cover. But I mean, honestly, it really doesn't matter because they ruin it in the next few minutes. Now, this is where they try to make Snow White seem super bold and brave. This group of rebels runs into these palace guards, and Jonathan is trying to tell her, like, run, save yourself, get out of here. But she wants to stay and fight. Imagine that. Snow White saying, I want to stay here and fight with you. It's astonishing to me that there are people out there who thought that this was a good retelling of this story. So Snow White uses herself as a decoy, and they use these like blue and gold rags to create like a false version of herself as a diversion for the palace guards, which again is completely out of character for her, and they don't even explain where the rags came from or how any of this happened, but it does. Don't ask questions, just consume product. Then one of the guards spots Snow White with the rebels, so he takes a shot at her with his crossbow. John actually dives in front of her and takes the arrow for her, and this is supposed to be like the moment when their relationship takes a turn. He's impressed with her because of her fighting, and she feels like he finally did something selfless for once. We get this gay ass fake out, like we're supposed to think John is gonna die or something, and I actually for a second thought that he was gonna die knowing Disney, but he shows up and he's just completely fine. This fake out was just totally lazy and completely unjustified. Then we get this random dancing sequence straight out of the show iCarly, and then the two of them just fall in love. No romantic buildup or anything. In the span of 2 scenes, they went from disgusted with each other to now they're in love. John gets arrested and thrown in jail with the huntsman. The evil queen turns herself into that ugly looking witch lady, and then she makes the poison apple, delivers it to Snow White. Snow White eats the apple and takes herself a little nap. John and the huntsman break themselves out of jail. John returns to the forest, kisses Snow White, and she wakes up. And instead of being faithful to the original story and having the dwarves effectively be the ones to kill the queen, because the writers just cannot possibly bear men killing women on screen, instead they have Snow White basically just lead an insurrection against the the kingdom, and suddenly she's like this beacon of hope to all the people in the kingdom, even though she hasn't been seen for years. And I'm just not even going to waste my breath talking about how out of character this is anymore. Snow White confronts the queen, and this scene is just totally wrong. They should have done it like they did in the live action Cinderella, which is easily the best live action remake of a Disney princess. It's not even close, so let's not argue. What they did was when Cinderella confronted her sisters and her stepmother, she did what she always did and just killed them with kindness. And in this version, Snow White is firm with her. She's like courageous. She's like really standing up to this queen, and that is just not Snow White. She even says, leave and never come back. Like, seriously, you fucking kidding me? The queen rightfully calls Snow White's bluff and then gives her this dagger saying, if you want the throne, kill me for it. And then the writers remember, oh yeah, we're writing a Snow White movie, so she obviously can't do it. So instead, the queen orders one of her guards to take the dagger and kill Snow White. Now, earlier in the movie, we learned that Snow White's parents taught her that it's good to learn people's names, so when the guard approaches her, she remembers his name and the names of every guard around her. So they did like this subtle foreshadowing, but it just felt kind of lazy and kind of inorganic, but it's whatever. Then she describes what she remembers about all these people before the queen's reign, and then they all turn to the queen and say, I remember. Fucking castrate me, that shit was so cringe. The queen retreats back to the castle, goes up to her mirror, and one last time asks who's the fairest of them all. The mirror lies through his teeth and says Snow White, and then she shatters the mirror with a scepter that was apparently important, but I didn't get the memo. Anyways, when the mirror shatters, she starts turning black because I guess she gets her power from the mirror, and then she gets kind of like Thanos snapped away, but like it's sucked into the mirror. People are speculating that the queen is still alive inside of the mirror, but don't be frightened now. There's not going to be a sequel to this reboot. Anyways, Snow White becomes the queen, and that's the end. This movie was just so sad, and I don't mean that in like the usual pathetic sense. I mean it in that it was just really unfortunate, because I'm sitting in this movie theater, right? And I'm seeing hundreds of names scroll up this screen of people who worked so hard to make this movie happen, only for it to be completely ruined by just a small handful of people, whether it be Rachel Zegler, Mark Webb, the writers especially, or the producers, or if it's just the executives at Disney. It really is true that a few bad apples ruin the whole bunch. I hated the movie, obviously. The movie Ralph Breaks the Internet portrayed Snow White better than whatever this piece of shit was, and even that movie was kind of cringe. I remember the movie Mirror, Mirror. I was a tiny kid when that came out, and I still remember it to this day. There's no doubt that that's probably the best retelling of this story. The production design is over the top. There's so much CGI. I really wouldn't be surprised if most of this movie was filmed in a warehouse somewhere. Again, Cinderella, the best live action Disney princess we have. Most of that movie was filmed on real sets. Listen, audiences are not asking for that much. This is filmmaking 101. Do as little as you can in post-production. Sound design is fine, nothing earth-shattering. The soundtrack is fine. The songs are just mid with the exception of like the source material songs, and then there was a couple that I hated. We'll get into one here in a second. Cinematography and editing is fine. It's Disney. They're all very professional and experienced. Okay, politics. My favorite. There's some subtle racial politics. Obviously, we have yet another white Disney princess who's been race swapped. This time it's for a Latina, even though it completely retcons the entire fucking point of Snow White. It's literally in the name, Snow White. They race swapped the evil queen, even though people are going to disagree with me on that because Jewish people are statistically more successful, which means that they're an oppressive white race, but that's just a whole nother mess. They race swapped the huntsman, and a lot of the extras are really diverse. And I mean, it wasn't too blatant, but it still looked more like modern day America than it did 16th century Germany. There's subtle female empowerment. Again, like I said before, they try to make Snow White look very bold and brave, pathetic, totally goes against her character. The queen sings this really cringy song about her power, and you can argue that she's making a connection to modern day conservative leaders who tend to lean more capitalist, basically saying that anything goes as long as you're the one in power, but you could also write that off as she's just evil. But there's also this part in the song where she says, ambitious girls need to be vicious girls, which was a shitty lyric that carried no weight in this movie. Then the more blatant element was in the whole critique of capitalism. The whole movie they're talking about sharing with each other and the queen's greed, kind of like how the entire left calls every conservative leader greedy and in the pockets of billionaires. The most blatant piece of shit propaganda in the movie comes when Doc, the main dwarf, goes on this brief yet unhinged tangent on the evils of capitalism. He's talking about how bandits often come and steal from the dwarves, and what he says is almost way too quick to notice, but luckily people covered this widely on the internet. So what he says is the only reason the bandits steal is because of the queen's greedy economic policies, which force them into a liminal space where ethics are harder to define. Does this sound like the dialogue of a fantasy movie taking place in 16th century Germany that's made for kids? Which, by the way, did I mention that this movie is apparently made for kids? All of this propaganda that promotes socialism or communism is just super ironic because you have this evil queen who steals everything from the people for herself. And anyone familiar with the country Venezuela knows that it works the exact same way there. And what kind of economic form of government does Venezuela have? Wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Socialism. But don't worry, sure, many countries have tried it in the past, but they just haven't tried it in the right way. Remember, this movie is made by the biggest film studio in the fucking universe. Tell me what the film industry is like in socialist nations like China, Cuba, Venezuela. How's it doing? Anyways, that was Disney's Snow White. For my final verdict, I will be ruling against this movie at 23%. My faith in the future of Disney princess movies died with Frozen 2, and this movie is just pissing on the corpse. Now, should you go see it, rent it, stream it, or just not watch it at all? For the love of God, please do not go see this movie. Disney really deserves it on this one. Just watch the original. Mirror, Mirror was fine. Snow White and the Huntsman was a masterpiece compared to this movie. Anyways, that's all for today. If you enjoyed this review, please consider dropping a like and hitting the subscribe button. But that's all for this case. This court is adjourned.